I was half asleep when the signal came through. That is the part nobody ever tells you about serving on a warship. 90% of your life is silence and waiting, and stale coffee, and the low hum of engines that becomes so familiar you forget it exists. Then, without warning, every alarm on the ship screams at once, and your boots hit the cold floor before your brain has finished waking up. The bridge of the UNS Pale Horse was already alive with activity by the time I arrived. My communications officer, Lieutenant Park, turned to me with the kind of expression I had learned to dread over the years. Not fear, something worse, urgency mixed with sadness. "Captain Wren, we have a distress signal, non-human origin. It has been bouncing through 6 subspace relays before it reached Terran Command." I sat down in my chair and pulled up the data. The signal came from a world called Oris 4, home to a species called the veelu. I knew of them. Most humans did. They were amphibian scholars, quiet and peaceful, the kind of civilization that built libraries instead of armies. They had never harmed anyone in their entire recorded history. Now someone was destroying them. The attackers were the Nathrek Dominion, slavers. They moved from world to world like locusts, harvesting entire populations and selling them across the black markets of the outer spiral. The Galactic Concord had issued stern warnings against them 17 times over the past century. 17 warnings, 0 actions. That was the Concord's specialty. They were very good at being concerned. But the detail that caught my attention, the one that made me set down my coffee and lean forward, was this. The veelu had not sent their distress signal to the Galactic Concord. They had sent it to us, to humanity. I understood why. Everyone in the galaxy understood why. We are not the oldest species among the stars. We are not the most elegant, or the most cultured, or the most technologically refined. We arrived on the interstellar stage barely 200 years ago, which is nothing by galactic standards. Some civilizations out there have been traveling between stars for 10,000 years. They expected us to be quiet, grateful, obedient newcomers who would learn the rules and follow them. They were very wrong about that. Within our first 50 years, we liberated the Dreth people from a century of nathrek occupation. It took us 3 weeks. The Concord had spent 40 years discussing it. Then we dismantled the Corvan pirate syndicate in a single coordinated strike across 11 systems. And when 5 Concord species refused to fight at the siege of Veloth Gate, we stood alone and held the line for 40 days, until the aggressors surrendered unconditionally. The galaxy gave us a name after that. Not warriors, not conquerors. They called us judges. When humanity arrives, we do not ask who started the conflict. We determine who is wrong, and we end it. That is our reputation. That is why a dying civilization on a burning world skipped past every other species in the galaxy and sent their cry for help directly to Earth. Terran Command gave me my orders within the hour. Respond, assess, intervene at discretion. No committees, no votes. No months of deliberation while people died. That is not how we operate. I assembled my fleet, 12 warships in total, with the Pale Horse at the front. We made the jump to Oris 4, and the moment we did, the galaxy started whispering. I monitored the subspace chatter during transit. It was fascinating, in a grim sort of way. The Galactic Concord released a panicked statement urging diplomatic resolution, which was their way of begging us not to do what everyone knew we were about to do. Neutral species began pulling their trade ships out of the entire sector. Cargo lanes went dark. Markets froze. A Jalori merchant captain broadcast an open warning to anyone near Oris 4. His words were simple. The humans are coming. If you are there when they arrive, may your gods protect you, because theirs will not. I allowed myself a thin smile at that. Then the Concord ambassador contacted us directly, a tall insectoid named Yivrin, all clicking mandibles and diplomatic pleasantries. He pleaded with me to wait for a diplomatic convoy. I asked him one question. Ambassador, how long has the veelu distress signal been broadcasting? He hesitated, then he admitted the truth. 11 days. The Concord had received it first. They formed a committee, they debated jurisdiction, they proposed sanctions. 11 days of discussion, while cities burned and children were dragged from their homes. I told Yivrin, politely, and without raising my voice, that humanity does not wait for permission to do what is right. Then I cut the channel. We dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Oris 4, and I saw what the nathrek had done. The planet's oceans were dark with ash. Dozens of nathrek warships hung in orbit like iron teeth in a cage formation, their dropships descending to the surface in steady streams. I could see 3 veelu cities burning from orbit. 3 cities, libraries and schools and homes, all reduced to smoke and rubble. And below, on the ground, nathrek soldiers were rounding up veelu civilians, loading them into transport ships like cargo. The nathrek fleet outnumbered us nearly 3 to 1. I did not care. Neither did my crew. I opened a broadcast on every frequency I could reach. Nathrek military channels, veelu emergency bands, galactic standard, everything. I wanted everyone to hear this. This is Captain Idris Wren, of the United Nations ship Pale Horse, representing the Terran Confederation. You are engaged in the unlawful subjugation and enslavement of a sovereign species. You have one opportunity to power down your weapons, recall your ground forces, and surrender to Terran custody. If a single veelu life is taken from this moment forward, I will consider it a personal declaration of war against my species. You have 10 minutes. There will not be 11. The nathrek commander responded almost immediately. His name was Warlord Ket Vorun, and his voice was full of the kind of arrogance that comes from a lifetime of bullying those who cannot fight back. He mocked us, called us soft, reminded me that the nathrek had conquered 40 worlds. I did not reply. I started a timer on the bridge display and told my crew to finish their coffee. Those 10 minutes were the longest of my life, and I have lived through many long minutes. In the first 3 minutes, the nathrek fleet reshuffled into an attack formation. They believed their numbers would save them. My tactical officer, Commander Lucia Ferraro, was already 3 steps ahead. Firing solutions had been fed into every ship in our fleet before we even dropped out of faster-than-light travel. Every human vessel had its targets locked. We had been ready since before we arrived. We are always ready. That is the part the galaxy never seems to understand about us. Between minutes 4 and 6, cracks appeared in the nathrek formation. 3 smaller vessels broke away and tried to flee. Vorun made an example of one, detonating it remotely to frighten the others into staying. I watched the explosion on my screen and added it to the ledger in my mind. That crew had been trying to surrender. Vorun killed his own people to maintain control. I would remember that. Then, during minutes 7 through 9, the veelu on the surface began transmitting again. They could see our ships in their sky. Their messages flooded our channels, frantic and hopeful, and heartbreaking all at once. Most were simple pleas. Some were prayers. But one transmission cut through all the others and buried itself in my chest like a blade. It was from a veelu schoolteacher. Her name, I would later learn, was Maori. She was trapped in a collapsed building with 40 children. Nathrek soldiers were outside. She could hear them. Her transmission was not a request for rescue. She did not ask us to save her. She simply wanted someone to know that they existed. She listed the children's names, one by one, in a trembling voice, so that if the worst happened, someone somewhere in the universe would remember them. I looked at Lucia. My jaw was tight. She looked back at me and nodded. Minute 10 arrived. The timer hit 0. Vorun had not surrendered. I gave one word: begin. The battle lasted 12 minutes. 12 minutes for a fleet that outnumbered us 3 to 1. I will not describe it with glory or excitement, because there was none. War is not glorious. It is a failure of every other option, and it is ugly, and it is loud, and people die. But when the alternative is allowing the enslavement of an entire civilization, you do what must be done, and you do it without hesitation. Our weapons were not superior because humans are smarter than other species. They were superior because we never stopped preparing for the worst. While other civilizations built elegant ships meant to impress, we built instruments designed for one purpose: ending fights before they become massacres. The Pale Horse fired a kinetic lance that split Vorun's flagship nearly in 2. I made sure the bridge section survived. I wanted the warlord alive. He had a debt to pay. Our marine dropships descended to the surface within minutes of the first shot. Terran Marines met nathrek ground forces in the streets of burning veelu cities, and the difference was immediate. The nathrek were slavers. They were accustomed to brutalizing unarmed civilians. They had never faced an enemy that fought back with discipline and fury and the full weight of moral certainty. The ground fight lasted less than an hour. Every slave transport was boarded. Every veelu captive was freed. Our Marines carried children out of collapsing buildings. Our medics set up field hospitals in bombed schools. One sergeant, a woman from a small town in Argentina, whose name I will never forget, walked through fire to pull a veelu elder from the wreckage of a library. She burned her hands so badly, she could not hold a weapon for a month. She told me later she would do it again without thinking. That is what we are. That is what they called for. I let most of the surviving nathrek ships flee. I wanted them to carry the story home. But Vorun's crippled flagship stayed right where it was. I boarded it personally. I walked through corridors lined with holding cells, hundreds of veelu crammed into cages meant for livestock. Some were dead. Some were children no older than the ones Maori had been protecting. I kept walking. I kept my face still. But inside, the fire was burning. I found Vorun on his bridge, wounded and defiant. He spat threats at me. He said the Concord would condemn us. He said the nathrek had allies. He said we had made an enemy of an empire. I crouched down to meet his eyes, and I spoke quietly, because the truth does not need volume. You are not the first tyrant to tell me that. You will not be the last. But let me explain something your kind has never understood. We do not do this because we are strong. We do this because a schoolteacher on your target list spent her last transmission reading the names of 40 children, so someone would remember they existed. That is who called us. That is who we answered. And every species in this galaxy knows that when you make someone desperate enough to call the humans, you have already lost. Not because of our ships, not because of our weapons, because of what we are willing to do for strangers. He had nothing to say to that. I put him in restraints and sent him to the brig. The days that followed were long but good. Terran cargo ships arrived with food, medicine, building materials, and engineers. We do not simply fight. We rebuild. That is the part of our reputation that matters most to me, though it is the part the galaxy talks about the least. The Concord publicly condemned our actions, calling them unilateral aggression. Privately, I suspect, they were relieved someone had handled the mess they were too cowardly to touch. Several smaller species sent petitions to Terran Command, requesting protection treaties. Our inbox, as always, grew longer. The nathrek Dominion recalled every fleet to their home systems and went very, very quiet. They did not declare war. They remembered what happened to the last empire that tried. Before I left Oris 4, I visited Maori in the field hospital. She had survived. So had all 40 children. She looked at me with enormous dark eyes filled with tears and asked a question I have been asked on a dozen worlds by a dozen species. Why did you come? We have nothing to offer you. I told her the same thing I always tell them, because it is the same answer every time, and it is always true. You asked for help. That is enough. That has always been enough. We returned to the Pale Horse. The fleet powered up for the jump home. I sat in my chair, finally allowing the exhaustion to settle into my bones. I reached for my coffee. Then the comm system chimed. Another signal. Another world. Another cry for help from a species I had never met, begging the universe for someone, anyone, to answer. I set down the coffee. I gave the order to change course. They call us judges, monsters, angels. It depends on which side you are standing on. I do not care what they call us. There is a signal out there, and someone is afraid, and we are the ones who answer. That is not a burden. That is not a curse. That is the most human thing I know,